Good morning.
There's
Buenos dias. It's good to see such a large group of people that are passionate about water this morning. And it's an honor to be on a panel with Mike Hammond and Norm Gom. And it was great to hear our Congresswoman this morning speak. And I'm grateful for her leadership and her water advocacy. So just really appreciate being here. I'm ready to go ahead and start the slide deck whenever you're ready.
Dominic. Do you have her slides?
Yes, just give me 1 second, please.
Okay.
While Dominic's doing that, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Paula Garcia, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Mexico Acequia Association. And I will be talking about equity today, although the agenda says I'm talking about equity in the Middle Rio Grande Valley. I'm approaching the topic more generally statewide, and there will be principles that apply there, but I also want to defer to other experts in the Middle Rio Grande, like Mike and Norm, to comment on some specifics in that region. But I have been working with the New Mexico Acequia Association as an advocate water policy at the state legislature since the late 90s, and have worked on various pieces of legislation relating to acequias and due process in the water transfer process, for example, and work with numerous acequias around the state on various water management challenges, and specifically have learned a lot in recent years about local efforts to engage in water sharing agreements, and that's one of our top priorities as a climate mitigation strategy, climate change mitigation strategy. So the topic for today is equity and water governance in New Mexico, water sharing, protection, and climate resiliency. Our organization is a statewide grassroots organization of acequias and community ditches, and we're governed by a federation of regional associations around the state, including the South Valley Regional Association of Acequias in the Middle Rio Grande, but there are 20 to 30 other regional associations around the state. And I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. The three topics that I'm planning to cover are the repartimiento. That's what we call the water sharing custom and tradition that's very inherent to acequias. And secondly, protecting existing water rights in this time of climate crisis and the era of reallocation. And thirdly, to talk about equity between groundwater and surface water rights. Next. This is an overview of where acequias are located in New Mexico, and you'll see that they're mainly concentrated in the tributaries to the major rivers of the Rio Chama and the Pecos and the Rio Grande, and mostly concentrated in northern New Mexico. But like I mentioned, there is a dot there in the Middle Rio Grande for the South Valley. As Mike mentioned, most of the acequias in the Middle Rio Grande were absorbed into the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, and it operates like a big acequia with more resources than an acequia. And then there are some acequias in southern New Mexico as well. So I've listed the main stream systems where acequias are located. There's between 600 and 700 acequias in the state, and that doesn't include the private ditches. Next. The important thing to keep in mind about acequias is that there are numerous, and they're autonomous. They all have their own governance, their own mayordomo, and their own commission, and they operate with little or no resources. They're volunteer entities. They most of them do not have any access to water storage, which is different from the other major irrigation entities in the state. We depend solely on snowpack and snowmelt in most acequias, and generally the irrigation parcels that we irrigate tend to be smaller, and they tend to be for subsistence or small-scale agriculture in some of the more rural areas of the state. One of the important things I wanted to point out is that there was some really good research published over the last several years and compiled into a book earlier in 21 from NMSU that published their findings about the benefit of acequias to aquifer recharge. And that's true for irrigated agriculture generally, but their study areas were on acequias in Alcalde, Taos, and El Rito, and they did document the benefits of having earthen ditches and how that helps to recharge aquifers. Next. So the first part I'm going to talk about is impacts of climate change on acequias and how we can support acequia resiliency through the repartimiento. And even though I'm talking about acequias because that's the community where I do my work and my advocacy, I think a lot of these topics are applicable statewide and certainly to the Middle Rio Grande. Next. These are just briefly things that have been touched on this morning already. But the acequia testimonials that we're receiving align with climate change predictions. Specifically, snowpack is decreasing. There's less and more uncertain precipitation, more extreme precipitation, higher temperatures, and the drought is intensified by this warmer climate. We did a survey at the end of 2020, and we were asking acequias in different regions of the state how they were managing with their water sharing agreements. And some of the acequias reported back that there was no water to share. And keep in mind that these sharing agreements are complicated. They involve numerous acequias, but they also involve in some places pueblos, and these are agreements that go back to the 1800s in terms of being formalized, and in some cases there's sharing agreements with municipalities such as Las Vegas. So when we hear reports that there was little or no water to share, that it got really difficult, that rivers dried, then we certainly feel like we've hit a tipping point in terms of the climate change impacts on acequia irrigation. Next. The water sharing practices are centuries old customs and traditions. The acequia-based allocation on a stream system is actually in the state statutes. It's almost like an exception to prior appropriation, and it's a carryover from the old territorial laws that codified repartimiento in 1850. But in addition to that, water sharing is also affirmed in the active water resource management general framework for the state that was promulgated by the state engineer and then upheld by the courts in the earlier part of the 2000s. And it's described in those regulations as a form of alternative administration. For acequias, the regional acequia associations play a vital role in water sharing agreements. Some of those water sharing agreements are being carried out or implemented through the framework of OSC alternative administration. And some of those areas include the Rio Chama, which involves acequias in the upper part of the basin and acequias norteñas in Tierra Maria area, and the lower Rio Chama closer to Abiquiu, and as well as Oquewingue Pueblo. In the Rio Jemez, it's between the acequias upstream from Jemez Pueblo and Zia Pueblo, and then San Isidro acequia downstream. So they're carefully crafted sharing agreements, and the conditions around each one vary. And then there's autonomous or court-ordered water sharing agreements in other parts of the state as well. And we like to view these agreements as a complement to administration by the state. They have some characteristics of being more bottom-up, especially autonomous water sharing agreements, and in some cases they're very closely worked on with the state engineer. So there's a top-down element and a bottom-up element as well. Next. The problem relating to water sharing, because we're really trying to talk about solutions today, the problem is that there's little or no resources that are explicitly allocated for water sharing agreements. And in terms of solutions, there are some entities that have resources for example, the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District does their own internal governance and management. In other places, there's a need for resources. Regional Acequia associations generally operate with volunteer resources. Local communities and even pueblos may need more resources when it comes to being able to be part of negotiations. OSC and ISC are under-resourced for providing technical support. There's also a need for leadership development around governance and collaborative decision-making that's across the board for all the different types of leaders and parties that are going to be involved in water sharing, and leadership development that's rooted in values and relationships, so that when conversations that are difficult come up, that there's some a medium of collaboration where that's taking place. Data sets are really needed, although they're more or less important depending on the context. Some acequias are sharing water based on observation alone, and that works for them. But in some cases, metering and river gauges are needed to have some data everyone trusts. And promulgation of active water resource management regulations in the district or basin level is really important. It's something that State Engineer's Office has outlined as a priority, and yet has not had enough resources to really carry that out. They refer to those as DSRs or basin-specific, district-specific or basin-specific regulations. Next. The second topic that I want to touch on is protecting existing water rights and the climate crisis. And the really critical issue we're facing with climate change is the way, of course, we see how it's affecting surface water, but we can't see with our eyes how it's affecting groundwater. But this is something that's covered in the Leap Ahead analysis. And Phil King discusses it in that report. But when we have climate change, it's reducing, it is happening, reducing river flows, that reduces recharge, and at the same time, entities and some growers in some parts of the state increase their pumping, and all of that is a recipe for aquifer depletion at a time when we should be conserving our aquifers for future generations. The trend with climate change is that we're shifting towards a greater dependence on groundwater as surface water supplies dwindle. The other issue is something I've started to think of as the climate crisis and water policy shock doctrine. For those of you that have read Naomi Klein and how crisis sometimes sparks a shock doctrine, and for us as traditional water users who protect our water rights through, protests and trying to keep water in the community and get a handle on water transfers and commodification. The crisis of water scarcity is sparking a trend toward trying to expedite water transfers and leases. There's a need for more robust analysis of impairment, but OSC is under-resourced, and political will to do that is lacking. Protection of existing water rights is a principle enshrined in our laws, but these protections are being sidestepped. For example, with the state engineer's practice of preliminary approval in water leases, which violates due process. Next. So this is just a slide about a water transfer, and this is a very knowledgeable water group, but I often use this to explain what we mean by a transfer is the change of point of diversion of purpose or place of use, and they're typically out of agriculture to M&I. Less often they're ag to ag, but the trend is surface to ground, and that's important to keep in mind. Next. And I'm just going to go through these fast, but the reason this is important to acequias, the reason acequias care about this is that when you start moving water rights around, there are impacts to existing water rights. And a lot of times acequias address this through protests. And, this is just a graphic to show you what impairment looks like on the ground. When there's a move from and a move to, there's an impairment downstream. Next. In another example, the previous one was Anton Chico. This is in Lincoln County. When you leapfrog from a downstream use to an upstream use, everyone in between is impaired. Potentially impaired, but very likely impaired. Next. So the problem that as we see it is that the current process of water transfers and leases is not adequately protecting existing water rights, nor is it evaluating impacts to water for future generations. Some of the solutions are to ensure that transfers are not fast-tracked. The OSC needs more resources and data to evaluate applications and modeling and staff to do these reviews so that due process is protected. And this process should not be shortcutted. And then thirdly, halt the practice of preliminary approval, which circumvents legal protections for existing water rights. Next. Lastly, part 3, what I wanted to share with you is the issue of equity between groundwater and surface water. And just to touch on this topic, I want to share with you 2 scenarios to think about. And in one scenario, you have a cannabis grower in the middle Rio Grande, and all the the growers in the middle Rio Grande who are maybe historic water users are being curtailed. They're having to shorten their growing season. They might even participate in a fallowing program. But a new cannabis grower can tap the Water Utility Authority, or they'll transfer surface to groundwater, and that user's going to pump, and everyone else around them's being curtailed. So there's an equity issue there. Another example is Rio Rancho. Rio Rancho has a permit to pump groundwater. They have to acquire water rights for offsets, and some of those may come from the Jemez Valley. Well, what's going on in the Jemez Valley? In the Jemez Valley, there's a very carefully negotiated water sharing agreement between the Pueblos and Acequias on a water short stream system. And they're curtailing themselves among each other, and the, for example, there's some detail about that I won't get into, but just keep in mind that their water source is going to go dry for part of the year. They're cutting back on their use. Rio Rancho doesn't cut back. They're pumping without constraints. So that's a water equity issue. So this surface to ground equity issue is very important in New Mexico. Next. And just to wrap things up, looking at the problem and solutions on this, the problem is that there's inequity between groundwater uses and surface water. And some of the solutions toward this are more rigorous conjunctive management of our water uses. Again, promulgation of active water resource management regulations and regional water planning that can utilize conjunctive management to in real time manage water resources, and having local decision makers having the tools to make decisions. And I'll give you an example of an Acequia. So let's say Acequias have the power to approve or deny a transfer. They need information whether to determine whether that's going to be detrimental to their community. And I'll give you the example next of supplemental wells. I think that's my next slide. Next. So here's the example of supplemental wells. One problem is so existing surface water right holders are transferring water rights, or new people coming in wanting to get supplemental wells, and that exacerbates impacts to aquifers. Now, Acequias have the power to approve or disapprove water transfers. For an Acequia, before allowing a supplemental well to come in, because these are, keep in mind, these could be some growers. They're not always an industrial use, but we have farmers themselves who want to do supplemental wells. Before the Acequia decides that, the Acequia would like to know, how much groundwater do we have? Or by allowing a well or a number of wells, are we going to be depleting irreversibly our groundwater? So they would need monitoring wells to know how much the water is being depleted, their groundwater, before allowing that transfer to go through. Also, if we have a better handle on what's in our aquifer, maybe we would have a threshold below which no more would be allowed. And that those are things that are important for protecting the aquifer for future generations. But we're nowhere near having that kind of data. So that's something to think about. Now, Acequia is in doing conditional approvals of supplemental wells. Sometimes we'll try to put a condition like, well, okay, you have 10 acres, you can't do all your 10 acres or all your 20 acres with a well. You're going to really affect the groundwater. But we like to approve it conditionally for your market garden, where you're selling produce for the farmer's market or something. Now, when that is approved conditionally by the Acequia, when it gets to the state engineer's office, state engineer doesn't go along with that. They'll say, no, it's all or nothing. You can't put conditions. So there's not the cooperation we need in order to try to protect our communities. And so what I'm describing is the subject of the third bullet, which is rigorous conjunctive management, having good groundwater monitoring wells. If there is going to be temporary movement of surface to ground in really bad years, or if there's going to be a long-term change from surface to ground, what are we really getting into, and how badly are we going to deplete our aquifers? Those are the questions we should be asking ourselves if we want to have any hope of sustainability for the future. Next. So that's it. Thank you. Those are the three main topics I wanted to cover, and thank you for your time and attention. Appreciate it. Thanks, Bob.
Well, thank you.